Hello, everyone. Today, we have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Jessica Hutton, who is the president of Natawihowin Consulting. Jessica, how are you doing today?
Thank you. I'm well. It's lovely to be here.
Amazing. It's such a pleasure to have you on. Really excited to dive in, talk all things business, your background, what the future looks like. So, I guess without further ado, shall we make a start?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Let's do it. So, Jessica, if you can take us right to the very beginning of where the story started, what does the perhaps early stages of your career look like? What does the journey of you getting to the position you're in look like? And if you can maybe tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for people that don't know.
Absolutely. I've had a very unique career path. Way back years ago when I finished high school, I had thought I wanted to be a teacher. And I did end up going into that field. I started into education. And actually, I ended up working as an interior designer and decorator for the first few years of my career, ran a business. And then it wasn't the right fit for me. And so I went back to school. And at that point, I had just discovered that I absolutely love psychology. I loved working with individuals. I loved, sort of that, especially that very acute, very crisis-driven trauma response psychology. And so I went back to school and got a degree and a master's degree and went to work in that field. And what was really interesting was I had thought that I had wanted to be a psychologist, and that was my aspiration, was to be a psychologist. And I went down that road and just hardly got into the licensing process and realized simultaneously I had gone to work for social services organizations, and I had had a few different experiences. And then I had actually been in senior management as a CEO in the not-for-profit mental health addictions, sector. And, I realized that I loved doing therapy with individuals, but I knew that my calling was more of the administration end of things, because I knew that I could make such a very big difference with what I had learned and being in the industry like I had been. And so I ended up sort of retiring out of that. And I had done a little bit of practice. For sure, I had some years of practice under my belt. But then I ended up just really staying in this senior management sector as not-for-profit leader for many, many years. And I loved the impact that I could have. I loved the work that I was doing, but the work is exhausting. And we're seeing a lot of burnout in this sector with senior managers, especially at CEO level. The funding, just the downloaded level of what we're dealing with in terms of crisis. And so a couple of years ago, I decided that was enough for me, and I started a consulting business. And I was able to start as a consultant and take everything that I have learned up till now and move it into consulting role. And that has just been tremendous for me. The last couple of years of really being able to be very intentional in the work that I do, bringing all of that combined capacity that I've had through the many, many years, almost 2 decades of work in that sector, and then coming over into consulting. It's just been an amazing experience for me.
Amazing, amazing. Jessica, what part of the journey do you think you evolved the most and sort of forced you to sort of level up to sort of make you the person who you needed to be to, really drive things forward with the business? Is there a moment that you kind of look back on and think really proud of that tough moment you went through to really drive you forward?
I can think of a number of those moments in my career, and part of that is because the nature of the work that I've done in this sector, I've always been in more of the crisis-driven area, which means that you're doing a lot of response to individuals that are on that life or death sort of area, and addictions and mental health. And so you're in that very high-paced, fast area of work, as well as just really standing back and realizing if we don't do something different, we're going to continue to lose people. And I think that's the pieces repeatedly in my career, is that I've never been afraid to stop and look around and go, what we're doing now is not working. And it's really not working. People are dying. And then taking that and going, okay, what do we do with that? And, I've heard more than once in my career, you can't do that, Jessica. Nobody's done that before. Well, good, excellent, wonderful. Then that must mean we're on the right track. And so that has never been a stumbling block for me. And I think those are the moments in my career when I look back, and like I say, I've had a number of those situations where I look back and everybody was saying something could be done. And then it was just like, no, we're doing it. We have to do something different. And what are we going to lose? So I think those are the pieces that have driven me and also kept me grounded at the same time.
Amazing. Very well said. Now, what does your role look like now at the company? You very much focus on the growth, expansion. Are you very much still focused in the ins and outs and working with the team? What does a typical day look like for yourself, Jessica?
Uniquely as a consultant, I don't have, I'm not at the helm of, the not-for-profits anymore, where I'm in that world. I get to support, a lot of my work is getting to support those who are still in that now, those roles. And what's really unique about that is that there turns out there's actually not very many of us who have sort of retired out of being CEOs and not-for-profits and come back and done the consulting work, or at least in our area there isn't. And so from that perspective, I'm able to go back and to do some of that support and guidance, and I'm really able to, help organizations to expand and grow and do what they do best. So I'm very lucky because I work across numerous sectors. So I work across our addictions, our mental health sector, our healthcare, our housing, our Indigenous relations, very, very different sort of portfolios. And I love that work because it keeps me very busy during my day, but it's also very, very different projects that I get to be involved in. And ironically, they're really all connected. I mean, everything from even at the energy sector, making sure that we have internet and energy up in our very northern parts of Canada so that we can actually get mental health care in. Those are things that I never had a chance to support and look at when I was working very, saturated in a not-for-profit world. And so now I get that opportunity. I get to look at projects. I get to pick the projects that I'm on. I get to see, I get to assess whether or not I really want to be a part of something, or whether I think it's very, very valuable, and whether I'm going to get that impact. And then I get to go with it. So that for me is huge in how I structure my day, is that I get to choose and I get to be part of things that are so fulfilling.
Amazing, amazing. Now, Jessica, we can come on to the next topic, which is really market trends, right? So what are some market trends or shifts in the industry that you're seeing? How can people navigate these constant changes and shifts that are happening? And what advice would you give to people that are out there to avoid these pitfalls that perhaps business owners and execs can kind of find themselves in? What is your overall thoughts on that?
I think there's a couple that spring to mind right away, coming from the hats that I've worn for many years. And the first one is, of course, in our sector, in that sector, charitable organizations, not necessarily for-profit business sectors, but the CEOs, the senior management, all the staff really are exhausted. There's not enough funds for the amount of work that we're doing. There's not enough people. There's not enough time. And I think that piece concerns me, having been in it for so many years, having gone through the experiences I've gone through, the exhaustion that I experienced. That is very difficult. And I think that worries me as a trend that we're seeing. And we have seen some very big movements of CEOs moving out of roles, getting tired, throwing in the towel, we're done. And I think that concerns me, that we're seeing that trend, because how are we going to mentor who's coming behind us to continue to keep these valuable organizations going? And I think at the same time, we're also seeing a trend around board of directors, that we need a lot of volunteers on board of directors, but asking people to volunteer and to put so much of their time and the risk and the liability on the line, and then not necessarily have the understanding or the training. The worlds are so different when you come from a for-profit into a not-for-profit, back and forth. What does that look like? And I think that concerns me as well too, is that, a lot of my work actually now is around supporting board of directors and helping really to grow them and help them to understand and do that knowledge translation. That is two pieces that I foresee, if we don't do some course correction here, we're going to end up in a situation, certainly, and where we're seeing across Canada as well too, we're starting to really go, ooh, what are we going to do here? How are we going to stop this? So I think those are two strong areas that we need to be looking at, and really focusing on how do we keep these robust agencies going, because they are the backbone of making sure that people are safe and cared for across our countries.
Absolutely amazing. Now, another trend, Jessica, I want to get your thoughts on is, obviously this trend's blown up and is massive, and probably essential for every business, is social media, right? Power of social media, online presence, being seen and heard, which was very different to perhaps a number of years ago. So what are your thoughts on social media? What are some ways you've been able to utilize social media to your benefit and business's benefit? And what are some, advice would you have for people who are looking into social media thinking, is this for me? Is this not for me? And sort of on that fence, what advice would you give in around social media as a whole?
It's key. It's pivotal now, isn't it? I
Mhm.
don't think there's much of a choice other than to utilize it. I love it from what we can access. I love it from the standpoint of its capacity to communicate, to be able to share things like statistics, to share demographics. Organizations that I'm working with, all of them are on social media. It is so important they have a presence. I've often talked about that communication piece. That's a connection to donors when you're looking at from a charity perspective. If you are
Yeah,
sharing the impact you are having, your donor base will increase. That communication piece is pivotal for that sense. But then you also look at that through a different lens of your marketing, your sales. If you have a strong social media presence and you are able to indicate why your product is as good as it is and why you are the best, obviously your sales drive up. So no matter, I don't think it doesn't matter what sector you're in, that social media piece is critical for driving that engagement at you. And then of course for either engagement with your services or the market or the sale of your product.
absolutely. And I think a massive sub-trend of the back of social media is actually the founder-led content. Whereas perhaps in the before you wouldn't really hear from or see really the CEO or execs of companies. Whereas now, if they don't have a page or if they're not on social media, you kind of think, oh, hang on, what's going on here? So
Yes.
what is your thoughts on founder-led content where kind of the people at the top are sort of coming out now, building a personal brand, showcasing the value and expertise they have, and kind of, being more forward to build that community around their business, around who they are. Is that something you've looked into, and it's something you're doing? Is that something perhaps you're looking into, and perhaps something for down the future? What's your thoughts on founder-led content, people
Yeah.
coming out from behind boardrooms and the curtains of offices?
Yeah. Yeah. I love it. And really for the reason that I was saying earlier around we need to have more, trained CEOs, and we need to have, these board of directors that, do feel like they have the skills and the development to have that capacity. I think when you have some of these, higher leaders in the organizations, from whether it's from the C-suite or from the founder or whoever it is, having those conversations on social media, I think what that does is it helps people. It's a learning opportunity. It gives you that leader, that sense of what does it take to lead something. One of the things that I through the years have heard of is, people say, oh, well, like that person's up in their ivory tower. Not anymore. We're not seeing that anymore. We're seeing the founders of so many of these organizations who are very real, and they are not hiding behind. They're not sitting in an office like that. That's changed. And I love that because I think that's helping in succession planning. When people are aspiring to be in leadership, they can really clearly see the reality of what it looks like to be in that leadership role. And I think that is what will help to move now the needle on getting really solid leaders into place and succession planning as the older generation of leaders retire out.
Amazing, amazing. Very well said, Jessica. Thank you for that. Now, if we can hone in now more on the business side of things. So, what
Mhm.
are some areas of the business that you feel are going really, really well? Strength to strength, and this is something you're really proud of. But what are some areas of the business perhaps you're having some hurdles and challenges you feel that you need to overcome? It could be anywhere in the business, operationally, it could be sales, marketing, client
Mhm.
relations. Where do you feel you're doing really well, and where do you feel perhaps you're kind of lacking and need some addressing?
I think from where I land, I've had a really unique experience in that I haven't had to do a ton of marketing because of where I've come from in my career. And that's an anomaly. And I fully recognize that I wasn't necessarily responding so much so to a market trend, but more of sort of like experience of needs of many years of being in this and knowing that, and then sort of going into it. And then just organically, everything has grown by word of mouth. So that's been a really, I mean, certainly for me, I've been again, very, very lucky that I had this, sort of abnormal career path in that regard. However, one of the struggles then becomes, and I've noted that this is interesting because this is always a struggle, no matter, I think, what business you're in, is when do you take the leap for that growth? And so, you've got to push, push, push. And then you're sort of on the cusp. And right at that cusp, it's always like, man, like when do we leap? When do we add more staff? When do we take that risk? And, as a business owner, as a founder, as a president, you're always weighing that, return on investment. When do we make that move? How do we make that move? What is the best move for the organization? And I think that's I think something that happens across all sectors is we all stand back, like, where do we take that leap? And I don't think there's a magic wand for that, for sure. I think it just, you have to you have to just assess and weigh your risk and what are you comfortable with. And certainly some people are less comfortable with risk than others are, but that's very much a place where I feel like I am right now, is really needing, I'm just really standing back, assessing the size and the scope of what it is that the firm does, and where do we take that next step, and who do we add, and what are we adding, and how are we being intentional. So very much an interesting place to be.
Amazing, amazing. Now, as we look towards the future, right? What does the next 6 to 12 months, or even beyond, look like? What are some perhaps personal goals you've set for yourself, and you're really looking to achieve? And business-wise, what does the next few years look like for the business? Is there some big goals on the vision board? And I guess if you're looking back on things, 10, 20, 30 years from now, reminiscing, what do you want to feel like you've achieved, and what you sort of would feel really proud of when you can look back?
Well, I think I didn't expect when I opened the firm that it would grow as fast as it did. And I feel like in a certain way, I've even had some moments of stepping back going, wow, okay. And things like, I thought, I didn't think I was going to need so much accounting because, I didn't think I was going to grow so fast. And all of a sudden, you need that major accounting. And I think those are the pieces, the exciting pieces. And I think from my perspective, I've loved that growth. I've loved to be able to be part of that growth. I've loved to see it take off the way it has. And then now for the next number of years, I would say, yeah, that would be the way I'd like to see things going. I very strongly feel intentional in the work that I'm doing. I have very clear ideas of what we take on for consulting as a firm, how we take it on, and what we choose to be involved in. The consulting, like the place that I sit as a consultant with my firm, is a very unique one because I have the capacity to, sort of say things and do things that are on the very front end. And I'm not bound by, any form of red tape anywhere. And that is a very humbling place to be. And it's also something that I very much have to think intentionally about, is where do we want to use our voice? How do we want to use our voice? And what does that look like for the firm? And where do we need to place our resources and our strength and our advocacy to really move the needle on some of these major trends we're seeing in social services? So I think the next number of years for me, like if I was to look back in 10 years, I'd want to know that my firm has made a monumental difference. Now, I would say in the last year, we certainly have. I've watched the major, and I know this next year that we're doing now, it's just even bigger and better than it was last year in terms of the growth, or in terms of the impact that we're having, and in terms of the capacity and the choices and contracts that we're taking to really make sure it's very intentional. So then looking back, from 10 years from now, I'd want to keep that going. I'd want to make sure that I've stayed intentional, that I've stayed true to the calling of why we started. The business name that I have is called Natawihowin Consulting. And so Natawihowin is a Cree word for, it essentially means the item that's needed for a cure. And that name came out of a conversation I had with a Cree elder many years ago about how I did my work and what I did for work. And he said, he commented on this, it's being like, this is what you do. Like this is the encompassing. And it's interesting because there's not an English word that actually encompasses. And yet there was this Cree word that was just so very much like, absolutely. I bring all of these items needed for a cure, for the change, for the remedy. And I love that. And I want the legacy of the firm to be, we did make a difference. We have brought all those things to the table. We are doing that work, and we are making that long-term change, and not just taking contracts on for the sake of taking contracts on, but instead understanding, okay, how are we moving the needle and what are we bringing to the table? Making sure they align for us the way that they align for the client as well too, and not just picking contracts up for the sake of picking up contracts.
Right. Amazing. And I guess, Jessica, to wrap up on, what is the biggest piece of advice you've received in your journey, or perhaps the biggest lesson you've learned that's been monumental to your success and growth as a business owner, that potentially someone listening right now would hear it and it could potentially change their life?
That's a big question, isn't it?
And with a bang.
Right. It's I think there's a few strong lessons for sure that I've learned, and that would be, you can always do it. And I think probably the biggest, the biggest thing I've heard that has driven me is those who have told me something couldn't be done. or underestimated the capacity. And that partly is personality, but partly is, that thought process of, like I said earlier, we have to do things differently. We have got to do things differently. We've got to do things in a way that foster change and foster innovation without just doing it for the sake of that, but, responding to what's going on. And so I think I would say, and I've always said to those who I mentor behind me, like, you can do it. If somebody tells you you can't, that's just more that's more drive to say absolutely you can. But at the same time, I think I've learned strongly in leadership around how to lead and how not to lead. And sometimes it's very important to watch and to learn how not to lead as well too. And I think those leadership pieces around that, understanding how to be as a person where it's your own integrity and how you're leading, you're fostering that leadership that comes with adaptability and integrity and, transparency, but also learning to empower others. And then also at the same time, knowing that you are ultimately responsible. So how do you make those decisions when you have to? It's lonely in that leadership, role. And so I think from my perspective, I would like to see more leaders be empowered in that process of knowing and being themselves in that process, and not feeling like they have to change or fit in or do something different, but really having that grounded sense of self and making decisions from that place.
Well, Jessica, it's been an amazing podcast episode, and thank you so much for all the insights, the value. I've really enjoyed myself. I hope you've enjoyed the time speaking, and
Awesome.
I hope everyone listening has found a lot of value. So massive thank you. Is there any closing comments or final thoughts before we do wrap up for, clients or, people that work with you, or anybody perhaps, looking up to you? Any final comments you may have?
Just keep doing what you're doing. I think we just all need to be focused on that, less of a judgmental approach and more of just keep doing what you're doing. We're all so valuable right now, and we're watching that in the world right now. The world has become such a small place. We're all valuable. There's not enough time. There's not enough all the things. Keep doing what you're doing. And then the rest of us, all of us around, if we have that community around us and we keep doing what we're doing, we will plow through.
Absolutely amazing. Jessica, big thank you, and thanks to everyone who's tuned in. We'll catch everyone next time. Bye-bye.